This video is dedicated to some of the most important Spring Boot concepts. I'll be explaining them through my latest project, the AI Clinic Router project. We'll look at concepts are used inside the Spring Boot application. Feel free to check out the full project link in the description. And now let's get started. So what is the role of a controller in Spring Boot? A controller handles incoming HTTP requests and returns responses. In my project, Triage controller receives the request at post API Triage. It extracts the symptoms from the request DTO and passes them to Triage service. Why should controllers stay thin? Controllers should focus on HTTP-related responsibilities only. They should not contain business logic, database access, or any complex processing. In my project, Triage controller only receives the request and delegates the work to Triage service. You will ask, what is the service layer? The service layer contains business logic and coordinates application behavior. In my project, Triage service coordinates two operations: AI department recommendation and doctor lookup. The service annotation marks the class as a Spring Boot managed bean. This bean belongs to service layer, by looking at the annotation. What is the dependency injection? Dependency injection means that a class receives the object it depends on instead of creating them itself. So my Triage service depends on AI department service and doctor service. Why use constructor injection? Constructor injection makes dependencies explicit and allows fields to be final. It also improves testability and prevents dependencies from being changed after object creation. What does request mapping do? The request mapping defines the base URL for the entire controller. For example, in my situation, all endpoints in this controller start with the API Triage/Triage. What is this post mapping? Post mapping maps the HTTP post requests to control method. So post mapping combines with request mapping and creates post API Triage. What is the request body? Request body tells Spring Boot or Spring to deserialize incoming JSON into a Java object. For example, I get symptoms, I have chest pain as JSON. This JSON becomes Triage request object. What is the difference between request body and request param? Request body is used for structured request data, usually in JSON. Request param is typically used for query params, like for example here, API doctors, department equal to cardiology. What is the difference between add_path variable and request param? Add_path variable reads a value from the URL path /API/department/5. Add_request param reads a query parameter @API/doctor, like this string right here. What HTTP status is normally returned when a controller returns an object successfully? That is 200 OK, unless another status is explicitly configured. What is DTOs or DTO package? DTO stands for Data Transfer Object. A DTO carries data between layers or between the backend and the client. In my project, I have these DTOs. This one is enum. I could have created another package for that. But because my project is small, I decided to integrate it into this package. So why not return JPA entities directly? Returning entities directly tightly couples the API to the persistence layer. DTOs give more control over which fields are exposed and make the API contract more stable. So what is the difference between request DTO and response DTO? Request DTO represents incoming data. A response DTO represents outgoing data. Why are Java records useful for DTOs? Records are concise and immutable data carriers. For example, this here automatically provides access constructor equals hashcode toString. What does request symptoms mean? Because try request is a Java record, its accessor is automatically generated and returns the symptoms field. What does addValid do? addValid tells Spring to validate a request object before executing the controller logic. So looking at some of the validation annotations, not null ensures that a string is not null, not empty, not only white space. The size annotation validates the length of a string or a collection. In my project, this is the size I have specified. So I ensure symptoms are between 10 and 1000 characters. What happens when validation fails? When validation fails, Spring throws method argument not valid exception. So my global exception handler catches it and returns a structured API error response. What is this REST controller advice? REST controller advice provides centralized exception handling across controllers. So instead of writing try catch in every controller, I handle common exceptions in one place. What does this exception handler do? The exception handler tells Spring which method should handle a particular exception. For example, this is method argument not validation exception. Then I have this one, runtime exception, department not found exception, etc. Why use a global exception handler? Because it provides consistent API errors, less debugging code, cleaner controllers, customized error handling. What is response entity? Response entity gives explicit control over the HTTP response. It contains status code, headers, body. For example, that would be it. What is API error response? It's my custom error response DTO. It contains information such as error, message path, timestamp, status, validation errors. Why use a custom exception like department not found? Custom exception clearly communicates what went wrong. So instead of throwing a generic runtime exception, I can represent a specific domain problem. What is the difference between checked and unchecked exceptions? Checked exceptions must be handled or declared. Unchecked exceptions extend runtime exception and do not have to be declared. My custom application exceptions are typically unchecked. What is Spring AI? Spring AI is a Spring ecosystem project that provides abstractions and integrations for AI models. It allows Java developers to work with LLM providers using Spring-style APIs. ChatClient is a Spring AI API I use to communicate with a language model. So why use ChatClient instead of directly calling DeepSeek REST API? ChatClient provides a higher-level abstraction. I do not need to manually manage HTTP requests. authentication handlers, request JSON, response parsing. Spring AI handles much of that already. Why could you switch from OpenAI to DeepSeek without rewriting most of the application? Because my business logic depends mainly on Spring AI's ChatClient abstraction rather than directly on a provider-specific API. The provider configuration changes, but the higher-level Java interaction stays similar. What does prompt method do? It starts building a new prompt for the model. What does system prompt do? A system prompt defines the model's role, rules, and behavior. So in my project, I tell the model, do not do this, choose this, use only this. What is user prompt? The user prompt contains the actual dynamic input. In my project, this is the patient's symptoms message. Why separate the system message from the user message? The system message contains application-controlled instructions. The user message contains instructed user input. Separating them makes the intent clear and gives better control over the model behavior. What does call method do? The call sends the prompt to the configured model and waits for the response. It is a synchronous call. What does add entity department recommendation do? It asks Spring AI to map the model response into a Java object. So instead of receiving raw text, I receive department recommendation. Why is structured output useful? Structured output makes AI response or AI responses easier to use in application logic. Instead of parsing free-form text manually, I can work with recommendation.department, recommendation.reason. Is structured AI output guaranteed to always be correct? The answer is no. The model can still return malformed or unexpected data. This is why I validate the result and use a fallback logic. Why do you have fallback logic in AI department service? Because the AI provider is an external dependency and can fail. It sometimes goes wrong, so if something goes wrong, I return generic medicine instead of crashing the entire request. Why catch exceptions inside the AI service instead of always sending them to the global exception handler? In this project, AI failure is treated as recoverable business condition. The application can continue using safe fallback. So I intentionally handle the failure locally. What is a graceful degradation? Graceful degradation means the system continues to provide a reduced but valid result when one component fails. So in my project, DeepSeek fails, for example, fallback recommendation gives me a general medicine answer. Why should an LLM not directly return doctor information in the project? Because doctor information is real application data, which is stored in database. The AI only chooses a department. The actual doctors come from doctor service and PostgreSQL. This reduces hallucination risk. What is hallucination in an LLM? Hallucination is when a model generates information that sounds plausible but is not grounded in real data. For example, an AI could invent a doctor who does not exist. That is why I separate AI reasoning from database retrieval. Why constrain the AI to an enum-like department name? A fixed enum limits the possible outputs. Instead of allowing the model to invent arbitrary departments, I restrict to these departments only. This makes the system more predictable. So I built the application using a layered Spring Boot architecture. The controller handles HTTP communication and validation. Triage service acts as the orchestration layer. AI department service isolates communication with the LLM through Spring AI's ChatClient. The model returns a structured department recommendation, which is then used by doctor service to query real doctor data from PostgreSQL. The final response combines AI-generated routing information with database back and doctor information. I also use centralized exception handling and fallback logic so the application can remain stable if validation fails or the API provider is unavailable.